Continuing from the end of part 1, we have episode 3. From this point on, I'll probably go into slightly less detail and just cover the bits with interesting secrets. The first secret to really mention is, well, not really much of a secret to people who know me, that being the fact that Hatchet was at one point my least favourite character for Series 1. And to be honest, he kinda still is, for that series at least. It's not that his story is bad, I just felt that it didn't really tie into a lot of the others, and he was mostly just added because I wanted to use his figure, it was my only PNSO figure at the time, and I needed to fill some time as I was running out of things to do in the forest and desert. His name is obviously a reference to the old theory about Allosaurus using its head like an axe, something which we kind of see him do in episode 6, but for this episode, he mostly just fights the ceratosaurs over shade and introduces the sauropods, who despite not really being characters, are very important to the plot. Nothing much more to say for this scene, so straight on to the next one. We move to the desert, and there we meet the Carcharodontosaurid pack again, and Gigabyte joins, where we get to see a bit more of his character, as the others immediately respect him. He goes down to the lake for a drink, and Kai is revealed, ending that short arc. I have wondered since then what would have happened if Kai had actually been able to grab hold of Gigabyte. I do think he might have been strong enough to pull him in. Kai is a character who I haven't really done much with in the later series, but I would like to, as he was one of my favourite concepts for Series 1. One interesting secret about this particular episode is that it actually contains 2 shots from my old dinosaur films, specifically this one, and a second one which I will point out when we get to it. I'll skip over Hatchet's next fight with the ceratosaurs because there really isn't much to talk about it. The only thing that might be noteworthy is the fact that when the ceratosaurs, 2 of them team up to knock over Hatchet, that's a reference to Doyle being knocked down by the Gigas in DI Season 5, but it's a very subtle reference and doesn't add much to the plot. We then get to the second shot that's from my old series, that being this one of the night sky. I didn't have a good nighttime shot, so I found it lying around in my photo album and shoved it in there as a temp shot and then forgot to remove it. With that, we see Monochrome creeping around in, well, monochrome. We see Frost narrowly avoid getting killed by him, and the old bull does get killed by him. Not much more to say for this episode, moving on. Episode 4 doesn't really have a lot of secrets. It's mostly just setting up for the big sauropod hunt of episode 5 and building the rivalry between Ceration and Monochrome, and just generally showing off how dominant Monochrome is. Since there isn't much more to talk about with this specific episode, I might as well reveal something from the editing stage of production now. That being that every single episode of PV Series 1 was originally edited in iMovie, before I got LumaFusion, and decided to touch up the sound design before releasing. This meant that I had to go back into iMovie and remove all the cheesy sound effects before transferring the projects to LumaFusion, where I added new ones. This is also technically where we get our first appearance of Anna, the Ankylosaurus from Series 3. I didn't know I was going to do much with her at this point. At this point she's just a random Ankylosaurus, but I have decided that canonically this is meant to be her. Something that is hinted at, I think, in Series 3. Don't know if any of you can guess where. With that, on to episode 5, The Culling. The first secret to be revealed here concerns the title, which is the only one in the series to actually be a reference to something. I'm not going to say what, because I'm kind of curious to see if anyone will get it, but it is a very subtle reference that I slipped in. It also has nothing to do with dinosaurs or dino tubes, so yeah, good luck with that one. The episode itself is one of my personal favourites from Series 1, and was one of my best performing videos at the time. The main focus of the episode is the epic clash between the sauropod herd and the Carcharodontosaurid pack that has been awaiting their arrival for the whole series. This is still one of my favourite concepts in PV Series 1. The idea of all the largest carnivores in the region gathering in one place to hunt the biggest prey is just awesome to me, and it really helps to sell just how important the sauropods are to the ecosystem of PV as well. This is also the episode where the concept of Ted is introduced, as an excuse for the Collector Deluxe Coolosuchus being out of scale with Frost. I was originally going to use a custom model instead, a Mastodonsaurus, but scratched the idea when its foot broke. Since there isn't much more to talk about with these upcoming scenes, I'll talk a bit about a character who I meant to talk about when he was revealed, Kai. Now, right from the start of PV, I knew that I wanted the oasis of Lake Labyrinthodon to contain some sort of water monster, and my old dinosaur films regularly contained aquatic creatures, including Kai, though he used to be played by the old Carnegie Kronosaurus. One idea I did toy with was the idea of Kai dying at the end of Series 1 during a drought that would dry up the lake, but I couldn't really think of a convincing way of doing that, so it didn't happen, though he did get beached in Series 2, which allowed me to reuse some of those ideas, the big difference being that he is still alive after that. Anyway, as I mentioned, there isn't much more to say about this episode, so let's move on to the finale, Episode 6, Loose Ends. The final episode of Series 1 is, in my opinion, the standout of the series. For a start, it is the only one to have been edited completely from scratch in LumaFusion. This was because of a glitch in iMovie that prevented me from transferring it to LumaFusion, so I opted to just remake it from scratch since it was the last episode. Although, what you're watching now is actually the original cut that I managed to dredge up from an old album. I thought it was lost forever, but apparently not. Changes from the original cut included removing about 2 minutes of unnecessary footage, it was just carnivores eating, and redoing all the sound effects. This was the first episode where I decided to turn the raw camera audio way down and add almost all the sounds in editing. And from then on, I wouldn't even bother making noises whilst filming, with the exception of I think one scene in Series 2. As the title would suggest, most of the episode is just tying up loose ends from all the storylines while we build up to the final battle. Here's an interesting fun fact. This episode was actually originally going to be split into 2. You can see here in a sec it says end of part 1, and that was because the episode was so long I was going to split it into 2, but after I removed a bunch of footage from the second cut, that wasn't necessary in the end. Now on to the final battle, which is interesting. One thing I wanted to avoid in PV was the kind of thing we see in like Prehistoric Island or like Spinosaurus Life, where all of the quote-unquote protagonists gang up on like one big carnivore or something. It kind of happens here, but I think it happens in a more realistic way of like a fight over a carcass. One thing you might be interested in with this scene is that Frost, in the very early versions of the script, was actually going to die to monochrome, but at the time I still wanted to do more with Frost, so I left him alive. Speaking of Frost, one thing I like about this scene is that, ironically, despite being one of the weaker combatants in the brawl, it was Frost's bite that arguably did monochrome in, as it was the injury to Monochrome's ankle that prevented him from fleeing when Gigabyte shows up. I suppose I should probably explain why Gigabyte kills Monochrome but ignores the other two. It's because they have lived under him for years and have always stayed out of his way, whereas Monochrome is a clear threat to Gigabyte's food supply and territory, attempting to take both for himself the moment Gigabyte leaves to take part in the sauropod hunt. Another thing about this episode is that it's the first time I tried out an idea I'd had for Series 2, giving each character their own theme song. Well, okay, only one character gets their theme song here, that being Gigabyte, but this is technically the first time it appears. Finally, with Monochrome defeated, the series ends. But by this point I was already working on a Series 2, and that would go on to be one of my favourite creations ever.